The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 18th chapter. Jesus says, "If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church, and if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Let them be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. It's interesting how often when we hear that, we think, oh, okay, I can write them off. Oh, wait, what does Jesus do with Gentiles and tax collectors? He gathers around the table with them and dines and offers them forgiveness and a new way of life. He stays in relationship with them. And so today, as we listen to these lessons, and we hear Paul start out by saying, "Owe no one anything except to love one another." Well, when he says it like that, it seems so simple, doesn't it? It seems like, well, of course we can do this. Of course, that's the thing. Now, as we were in Bible study the other evening, one of the people in the room said, "Well, Pastor, it sure seems like if you read this first part of this chapter of Romans, it seems like we probably should have read this last week before my taxes were due. Because just before this, Paul writes to that congregation in Rome that if they owe taxes, they should pay the taxes. And then we hear, owe no one anything except to love one another. At some levels, it sounds like he's saying, it doesn't take that high a standard, but if we listen closely, what he's doing is he's actually raising the bar. He's holding us accountable to a higher way of understanding things. And indeed, what he's talking about is a way to live together in community. You might remember that in Rome, part of what's going on is that this congregation has formed. And in this congregation is good Jewish folk who want to be true to their Jewish heritage. And then there are all these Gentiles, these outsiders to the faith. And there's a bit of a conversation going on. Some people say that I'm given to understatement. There's a bit of a conversation going on between these two groups about how to live faithfully. And in the midst of it, as Paul is holding up for them the way to live as community, he tells them, make sure that in the end, what you do is you attend to the law. And the law that you need to attend to is not necessarily all that law that those of you who are Jewish are wanting to attend to, but rather remember that the fulfillment of all the law comes down to one thing: loving one another. Owe no one anything except love. And so there is this call to live faithfully. Now, if I were to ask you, what does the law mean? What is the law? I am fairly confident, because I've done it a few times, I'm fairly confident that people start talking about the law as all the ways, all the things that restrict our movement, that guide us, that tell us where the limits are that we aren't supposed to cross over. That the law is about drawing the boundaries. So when we come up to the stop sign out here, we know that we're supposed to stop and not just charge across the street. And we know that, particularly at certain times of the day, there's a high probability if you were to not stop at that stop sign, you'd get smacked by a truck. And so when we understand the law in that way, it is about kind of constricting us. But in the Hebrew tradition, and in the tradition that many of those who had come into that congregation, the way that they understood the law was that what the law does is actually bring freedom. What the law does is it frees us to live in community together. That the law isn't about the ways that it constricts and confines us, but rather about the ways that it frees us to care for our neighbor. The purpose of the law, the benefit of the law, is less about saving our bacon and more about how we care for our neighbor. It's for the sake of our neighbor, for the sake of the world. And so today we hear this call to be ones who show by our actions and our words our love for our neighbor, for those around us, for those who are outsiders. And it's no accident that in the midst of this, Jesus acknowledges that sometimes it's hard to be in relationship with one another. Sometimes we sin against each other. We break relationship. We say and do things that hurt our neighbor. And he lines out a strategy. And we all know how difficult that strategy is, because we all know that my first, and I suspect it's true for you, when I feel hurt by somebody else's action, my first response is not to go to that person and say, gosh, what you did really hurt me. My first response is to find somebody else to tell and somehow get them involved. And if I'm really lucky, then they'll come in and mediate my relationship with that person who hurt me, right? If they're really smart, they'll stay out of it. What Jesus does is he invites us to go to a different way, and that is to go to that person. And if that person, well, you know the drill. You also know how difficult that is. On this very same Sunday where we hear those two things being held up, love one another, do no harm, but more than that, ensure that your neighbor has freedom to live fully in community. And when that falls apart, well, here's a strategy for dealing with that. But then we hear Ezekiel, and what we hear from Ezekiel is a charge to the sentinels. The sentinels are the ones up on the wall looking out at the horizon, watching for danger. And if the sentinel does not do his or her job, well, okay, back then it was his. They do not call out and let people know that there's a problem coming. Do not let them know that there's danger coming. Now, the interesting thing about this reading is in Ezekiel, it is the very last teaching before the Babylonian Empire comes in and starts to wipe out Judah and Jerusalem. It's a warning to make sure that you let people know that the danger is coming, because with that danger, If you're the one in charge of setting out the warning and you don't, then it's on you. But if you set out the warning, then it's on the people who have heard the warning. If they don't respond, it's on them. We are called sometimes to name the danger that is on the horizon and even the danger that is closer at hand. At the same time, sometimes once we've named it, we need to back off and just let folks deal with the warning that they've heard. All of that, though, is about caring for and loving our neighbor. And so today on this Rally Sunday, as you heard Pastor Mike talk about, this is a day when we are called to serve. In fact, all throughout the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we are called to serve. 10,000 congregations are called to a day of service, of loving our neighbor. Those who are inside the house and those who are not. Those who are faithful believers and those who are not. We are called to love the world as God loves the world. And in this place, in fact, our Sunday school children will go downstairs and they will be invited to engage in a service project. But not only those children, you see, way back in, what was it, February, when we had that vision retreat, one of the things that we talked about was having intergenerational events. Events where not only the children were there, segregated from all of us folks who know better, right? But rather the children and their parents and their grandchildren and grandparents and the whole congregation is invited to gather around and participate in this. And with a couple of the projects, I'm here to tell you, it could be really interesting. Something about flower and carpet. I'm working this out in my head. The call, though, is for us to serve the world in light of God's love. Because that fulfills the commandments. It empowers us to be the community of faith in such a way that we are freed and we free one another and we free others to come into clarity about the gifts that God has given us that reveal the gospel. And for Paul, in the first chapter of that letter to the Romans, Paul says that the gospel is the power that reveals God's righteousness. And that righteousness is nothing other than God's faithfulness. A faithfulness that has been revealed over and over through time. A faithfulness that calls all of us to faithfulness. And as we live that faithfulness, we were empowered. We're empowered to love our neighbor so that our neighbor can live more fully into all the gifts and blessings and community and grace that God holds for them.